If you've ever felt like you don't fully belong to one generation, like you remember a childhood without the internet, but an adulthood shaped by it, like you understand both analog and digital worlds, but don't feel completely at home in either, that in-between feeling isn't random. It's something a lot of people born between 1976 and 1985 quietly carry. And it says more about your psychology than you might think. Because being a Xennial isn't just about when you were born. It's about how your identity was formed, right in the middle of a transition. You grew up in a world that was slower, more physical, more present. Phones were attached to walls. Conversations weren't documented. Mistakes didn't follow you forever. And then everything changed. Technology didn't just enter your life. It reshaped it while you were still figuring out who you were. So your mind had to adapt in a way most people don't fully understand. On the surface, it might show up in small ways, like feeling slightly uncomfortable with constant online visibility, or preferring real conversations over endless messaging, or needing space from digital noise, even if you still use it every day. It might look like you're just being old school, but it's rarely that simple. Because part of you was shaped in a time where identity was private, and another part was forced into a world where identity is constantly expressed. And those two systems don't always align. So you might notice yourself being more cautious about what you share, more aware of how things can be perceived, more selective with your presence. Not because you're overthinking, but because your brain learned two different rules about visibility. One says, stay private. Stay grounded. Not everything needs to be seen. The other says, be visible, stay relevant, share to exist. And living between those two creates a subtle tension. You're not fully comfortable disappearing, but you're also not comfortable being constantly exposed. So you find a middle ground. And that middle ground becomes part of your personality. It also shows up in how you connect with people. You probably value depth over speed, meaningful conversations over quick interactions, presence over constant availability, because you experienced connection before it became instant, before replies were expected immediately, before relationships were filtered through screens. So part of you still measures connection differently. You don't just look for response, you look for presence. And when that's missing, something feels off, even if you can't always explain why. You might also notice a certain independence in how you think. You're used to figuring things out on your own, learning without instant answers, sitting with uncertainty longer than most, because you grew up without constant access to information. And that built a different kind of patience, a different relationship with not knowing. But at the same time, you adapted to a world where everything is immediate. So now there's this quiet contrast inside you. Part of you is patient. Part of you expects speed. Part of you is grounded. Part of you feels pulled by constant updates. And that internal contrast shapes how you move through life. Sometimes it looks like overthinking. Sometimes like hesitation. Sometimes like stepping back when everything feels too fast. But underneath, it's your system trying to balance two completely different environments. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of people assume that this in-between identity creates confusion, but the real pattern isn't confusion, it's dual awareness. You can see both sides of things more clearly. You understand the value of privacy, but also the power of visibility. You see the benefits of technology, but you're also aware of its cost. You can engage with the modern world without fully losing your sense of grounding. And that creates a kind of quiet observation. You're often aware of shifts before others notice them. You pick up on changes in behavior, in communication, in attention, because you've seen what things were like before. And that perspective stays with you. It also affects how you handle change. You've already adapted once, in a major way. So part of you is flexible, but another part is cautious, because you know how much change can reshape things, not just externally, but internally. So you don't just accept change automatically. You observe it, you question it, you take your time with it. And that can sometimes make you feel slightly out of sync, especially in a world that moves fast and expects instant adaptation. But that slower processing isn't resistance, it's awareness. You're not just reacting to change, you're evaluating it. And that's a different kind of response. There's also something deeper happening with identity. Most people form their sense of self within one consistent environment, but for you, that environment shifted halfway through. So your identity isn't built on one system, it's layered. Part of you belongs to a more grounded, offline world. Another part exists in a fast, connected digital space. And those layers don't replace each other, they coexist. That's why you might sometimes feel like you don't fully fit into generational labels. Too digitally aware to be completely analog, too grounded to be completely digital. And that in-between space becomes its own identity. Not always loud, not always obvious, but very distinct. It also explains why you prefer balance over extremes. Too much noise feels overwhelming. Too much isolation feels unnecessary. So you naturally adjust. You step in, then step back. Engage, then disconnect. Not randomly, but in response to what feels sustainable. And over time, that becomes a pattern, a way of regulating your environment without fully thinking about it. From the outside, it might just look like preference, but internally, it's adaptation, a system shaped by two different worlds learning how to exist between them. And once you start to notice that, a lot of things begin to make more sense. Why you value certain types of connection, why constant visibility feels draining, why you don't fully relate to either side. It was never random. It was shaped by timing, by exposure, by experiencing a shift most people only know from one side. And that awareness changes how you see yourself, not as someone who doesn't fit, but as someone who adapted differently, someone who carries two perspectives at once and moves somewhere in between. Once you see it, you can't really unsee it, and that quiet understanding stays with you. If this explains something you've noticed in yourself, there's always more beneath the surface.